I was recently speaking at an investigators meeting in Florida, and the lead investigator from New Jersey came and said, Claude, I don't know how to say this, but, you know, I'd just like to tell you a few stories. And he started telling me these stories, and I said, stop. Do it properly and talk to all the other doctors. So his assistant, who was a bit like Dr. Hibbard here, sort of did it properly over the lunch, and there were these lovely stories of people kind of coming back. And his final comment on it when he was presenting it to the audience was, well, I know these are just stories, it's not science, but it sure as hell helps the morale of the principal investigator in the clinic he's talking about. So I look forward to that. So I really love Angela's title, except I mean it not the way she means it. She means Alzheimer's without dementia. In other words, she means having the diagnosis without the stigma. I mean having the diagnosis without the illness. And that's...
That is what I meant.
Right, okay. But that's actually where I want to get. So let me just sort of, I know this is a mixed bathing audience, so I have to be careful and kind of not overload you. And I'm sorry, I've actually changed the presentation. I can only think about the presentation on the day I do it. I can't really do this sort of a week in advance as Ema wanted. But this amyloid has been, as she introduced it, has been the kind of dominant theory. But the year before last, there have been a string of failures, and this just summarizes them all. In fact, there have been 19 failed trials at a cost of $15 billion. And here's us working on the tangle, which is actually what Alzheimer discovered. Now, we never worked on amyloid, and the reason for this was basically when I was still in Cambridge, we did a study looking at how much amyloid there was in the brain of controls, so just normal elderly people and people with Alzheimer's disease. But these weren't like the cases you've heard of early stage Alzheimer's. These were what we used to call people in the back wards of the old psychiatric hospitals around Cambridgeshire. And I used to describe this, pardon the language, but you know, here are people who can play bridge, and here are people who can't feed themselves or find their way to the toilet. But you can see there's a 76% overlap. And we decided in our infinite wisdom that the levels of amyloid in the brain actually couldn't explain dementia. Now that was quite a while ago, and now from the Harvard study, exactly the same result, that now you can measure the levels of amyloid in the brain with an amyloid brain scan, and you find exactly the same thing, this huge overlap. People are focusing, as Dr. McSweeney correctly says, that if you have it in your brain, then you're likely to progress. But that doesn't mean that a treatment based on that is going to necessarily work. So you see this slogan here, which some of our colleagues from Medici, who you see around the place, dreamed up, and I think it's really good. The time for tau is now. I mean, the dominant theory for the last 20 years has been amyloid, and it's been really tough finding money to do this. So I'll just say a few words about this orphan tau. So here's the science bit, bear with me. Here's a nerve cell, and here's an axon, and this does all the business of communicating different parts of the brain. And inside that axon, there are things called microtubules. And holding these microtubules together is a protein called tau. So here are the connections with different parts of the brain, which right now you're doing as you link what I'm saying with what you're seeing and what you're thinking. All of that's going on simultaneously, and different parts of the brain are activated. But all of that's happening in a particular class of cells called pyramidal cells. And these are the cells where the tau protein begins to aggregate, and it first forms these little what are called punctate aggregates, so just little bits of stuff in the nerve cell, and gradually form filaments and eventually tangles. Now, what we discovered when we discovered this tau protein is that it's a prion. Now, what does that mean? It means that the little fragment inside these tangles is able to bind a normal molecule, but the cell can't get rid of it and digests it away with proteases, and you leave behind this little fragment which retains the ability to propagate the thing. So it's self-propagating, self-progressing. Let's see if I can show you this a little bit. So here's this. My son just produced these graphics. He's doing a talk to Microsoft about some. I'll tell you a bit about what he's doing, but he does better slides than me, basically. So to cut a long story short, so here's a normal nerve cell, and this is a tangle. And this is exactly how Alzheimer saw it in 1906. This is what he actually saw. And he used a kind of a variant of a photographic developer solution to see this. So here's what happens. So these little aggregates start to form, and they aggregate into these filaments. Then the filaments just continue growing for the reason I said before, until they just blow up the cell. And then what you're left behind with is a what's called a ghost tangle, which is really just, or tombstone tangle. It's what's left behind after this tangle has grown inside the nerve cell. So that's going on in the brains of people who develop this from an early stage. So all of the people who are talking earlier, in particular Dr. Hibbard, I think she captured really beautifully this experience of, oh, it's depression, or it's you're drinking, or it's a personality thing, or anything really. But in fact, it's this stuff forming in the brain and gradually destroying nerve cells. That's what it means to say a neurodegenerative disease. It means this stuff is actually happening in real time. And you get these filaments forming, which are just growing. And there you have it. That's what I mean by prion-like. It means that once it's there, it becomes the seed for making more of it. Now, the really bizarre thing, or terrifying thing, that was discovered kind of 3 years ago is that this process is infectious. So you have these little aggregates forming, and they pass from one nerve cell to the next. So it's not enough that they kill the cell in which this is all going on. It passes into the next neuron and begins the process all over again. So it's like a viral infection that is spreading through the brain. Now, that spread is very well documented by a brilliant researcher from Germany called Brach, Heiko Brach, and he devised a staging system. So here are 6 stages, the so-called Brach stages. And we were able to show that there's a high correlation between Brach stage and how demented you are. So this is a very simple little 30-point scale. And if you lose 5 points on it, you know, what floor are we on, what day is it, that sort of thing, then you have mild AD. And if you lose 10 points, you know, you can't remember a few things, then you have, you progress from as Dr. McSweeney was saying, this mild cognitive impairment to mild to moderate to severe. This 30-point scale is extraordinarily cruel. Just these silly 30 points describe the whole story of the destruction of a person. Recently, as Dr. McSweeney said, there's been lovely studies showing correlation between the amount of tau now picked up in the brain and this decline on this 30-point scale, which is exactly what we predicted, but the amyloid scan doesn't. So this explains why we consider the tau part of the story to be terribly important. I want to give you some figures which really come back to what Mark Wortman was saying, because this Braque staging thing, the different stages of the disease, you can do all sorts of maths on that. And actually this all comes from Braque, where he looked at 847 cases post-mortem, and he looked at the age probability of transitioning between these different Braque stages. So this is the age probability of being Braque 1 or beyond, Braque 2 or beyond, Braque 3 or beyond, Braque 4 or beyond. So when Angela is saying that, we just need to get used to this, this is like diabetes, there's a lot of it, there's no stigma, this is what she's talking about. She's basically saying that many, many people have this, and that it is completely crazy to have this system or failure to be able to talk about it, to seek help, to communicate, to get diagnosed. I mean, if, for heaven's sake, if this was diabetes, if it was on this scale of these kinds of numbers, it would be an epidemic, and that's exactly what the G8 folk are saying. Look, wake up, this is an epidemic. And this is what the numbers are saying. So here, look at the UK. This is the age distribution of the 6.7 million people, not 700,000 or 800,000, but the 6.7 million people who are at Braque stage 1, the 3 million people who are at Braque stage 2, the 2.9 million who are at Braque stage 3, and the 1.7 million who are at Braque stage 4 or beyond, of whom about 700 actually fit the bill of being diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease. So that's what Angela is talking about. This is really massive, what's going on. Just to put this in context for you, I'll summarize all of that just with this very simple statistic. For the population over the age of 45, there is a 50% probability, 50, of having some degree of tau pathology in your brain. Okay? Of that, 25% is Braque stage 1, 10% is Braque stage 2, 10% is Braque stage 3, and 5% is Braque stage 4 or beyond. Just think about that. Every person over the age of 45, 50% probability of having some degree of this, not the big deal dementia form, the whole tragedy, the life falls apart, the family falls apart, but the quiet, ongoing, progressive development is what's going on. Now, this isn't just happening in UK. Here are the figures for Europe. So you can see right now there are 170 million people who have some degree of tau pathology. That's going to go to 223 by 2050. In the US, exactly the same thing. There are 63 million, and it goes up. Asia is extraordinary. There are 500 million people today who have some degree of this pathology in their brains. That's going to become 1.2 billion by 2050. So, the key points I've been making. So tau aggregation is an infectious, self-propagating pathology that spreads through the brain. It's extremely widespread and presents a global problem for all aging societies. There's an urgent need to develop better preventative treatments and better, cheaper diagnostics. So this is where, this is literally the word from the sponsor, because we actually have partly sponsored this meeting. So I'll just tell you a bit about the phase 2 trial. It was predominantly done here in the UK with our drug. And what it does, I told you this bit, that these little aggregates form and spread. What our drug does is it just destroys these aggregates. So let me show you that the way my son sees it. So you see, what's happening is, let me just go back again and just show you that again. This is really neat. Right, there's a filament. And now what's happening to it? With the treatment, it is basically dissolving the filament. Yeah? And now the cell can clear it. Now we made these discoveries in the 80s, but it's taken a long time and a lot of money to get to the point where we are now. Let's skip the science. So what the trial did, this was 16 centers in the UK, 321 subjects. The control arm, this was the decline, and the optimum treatment arm, we arrested progression. 85% reduction in the rate of progression. This is, again, my son's version of this, which is much better. So this is in the mild cases, and this just shows you what we did compared to what Aricept does. So Aricept is the most common drug that's currently prescribed. This comes from Pfizer, this particular one, but it doesn't do a lot. It basically gives you a bit of a boost, and then the disease progresses nonetheless. What is meant when Dr. McSweeney talks about disease modifying, changing the trajectory of the disease, is this. So that's what we managed to achieve with our phase 2 trial. So we're now running 3 trials in parallel, big deal things, in mild AD, in mild moderate AD, and in frontotemporal dementia. And contrary to what Emma said, I'm not going to give a lecture on frontotemporal dementia, just we are doing a clinical trial in it, which is estuary slang for I don't know what it actually means, but EMS, in ARF, how does that go? I'll remember the joke later anyway. It in ARF ot in it, that's it. How do you spell that? How do you spell in it, is what he says. Anyway, but so we're doing a trial in it. In 180 subjects. Now, they're really hard to find, these cases with frontotemporal dementia. We've got about 25 in the trial so far after screening 450-odd people. It's hard to diagnose, which is exactly why you need the Dr. McSweeneys of the world, who are really expert at this, kind of to do the work, so to speak, and to really reach the diagnosis. Anyway, let me try and show you what the scale of this is. So here's the timeline now. So this is the one trial, the mild moderate study, and we're almost finished recruitment. We're here in the early part of 2014. We hope to have results in the first part of 2016 from these studies, and we're going to be the next big news. These guys don't report, and that's the kind of slide I have to show to my shareholders. Just to tell you, this little bit of research that you're seeing here, this trial, I'll show you the scale of it. It's running in about 250 centers around the world, and EMA is up here somewhere. Centers in the US, centers in Asia, centers in Australia. To run this trial is costing between $220 and $250 million, which we've managed to raise. Not a penny has come from the UK, not a penny. It's actually come from Far Eastern investors. Although this discovery we made in Cambridge, all the work was done in Britain, it's owned by Far Eastern investors who are more willing to bet on a risk capital. This is risk capital. So when the G8 talks about R&D money and links between academia and industry, this is it, except we didn't get a penny from G8 or anybody. Anyway. Sorry?
There was a lot to do.
Well, yeah. Well, I still need another 100 million, or the trial will run out of steam. The last thing I want to say is just this improved diagnostics, because I think that's really key to all of this. My mentor, Sir Martin Roth, always used to tell me again and again, Alzheimer's is a loss of personhood. It's not just loss of cognitive function. And I think the stories you've heard tonight really illustrate that. But let me just illustrate, the scale of this in real terms here in Britain. So there are 5 million affected, and what that means, that this is the 5 million who are at Braque stage 3 or beyond, but there's another 10 million waiting in the queue, so to speak. And to work through all of those, you need a highly expert team, which takes quite a while, and then all these tests, and really doing it properly, costs about £2,000. I know that because I'm paying for all of the people in our trials to have all of this done, so I know exactly what it's costing. And that's cheap, actually. In the US, it's like not quite double that. So here is the job of work. The GPs are actually very aware. They know, because we did research on this, to what extent do you recognize that something's wrong? So of all of these people, about 0.8 million present with symptoms. The GPs actually know much more than that, actually, but only about 0.4 are being treated. So that's really what's going on. That's the reality today. And again, this is research that we did that cost quite a bit of money to get these figures. So how do we improve the situation? Well, this is the bit that my son is doing and that he's presenting his talk in Microsoft on. I mean, he works at Microsoft, but it's developing phone apps and tablet or iPad tablet apps that would assist GPs, that would assist nurses. But then what we're also thinking of is apps that the worried daughter can run on mum, or the worried son can run on mum. So that's going to come out in the near future. The other really interesting thing is blood tests. This isn't ours, unfortunately. This is a Danish company. But what they're showing is the level of tau that they've picked up in the blood. So it's not lumbar puncture, but in the blood. And its link to how much the patient declined at 40 weeks. So this is very promising. This is very exciting. And they've got by combining a number of markers, they've got a really good handle on this. So here you have the increase in this ratio of 2 different tau markers in the blood and decline on a mental scale. So that's how the future looks. And we have to try and do a deal with this company or do better than them or whatever, but this is how it has to be. The patient has to be able to come into the GP. The GP has to be able to pick it up and do enough of a test, probably not the GP, but probably a nurse, a GP practice nurse who will do this kind of simple tests to say, yes, this is important. Blood test. This gets done. Then, this is my dream of the future, that then there's a kind of a simplified EEG. So people have electroencephalograms. So, they have brain waves. They measure brain waves. But the clever thing now is that you can measure this loss of connectivity in different parts of the brain using very sophisticated maths. And we've got a group working on that. In fact, using the data that we're picking up from the clinical trial and trying to develop these tools for the future. And of course, there's the newly developed tau imaging agents, so you can really see it, you can confirm it. You can come to Dr. McSweeney's clinic, they'll do the scan, and there, it's done. And it's definite. But That's expensive, that bit. So all of that workup has to happen beforehand. So this is how it's going to be in the near future. The demographic scale of the problem is too vast to sustain specialist-led models of diagnosis and management, particularly in Asia. The availability of relatively cheap preventative treatment will transform the way cognitive impairment is detected, managed, and monitored. In the future, the main site at which all of this happens is in the GP clinic. And specialists like me, I'm an old age psychiatrist, our job will be a bit like the cardiologists, to just look at the more severe things, the more complicated things. But really, the business of this has to happen in the family GP setting. So that's the future. And let's hope that our drug, when it completes the phase 3 trial, opens the door to that future for us all. Thank you.